let's talk about digestion overall. Thinking back to last week when we learned about macronutrients. So we learned about all the polymers, so protein, fats, and carbohydrates. The goal of digestion is to break these macronutrients down to the point that we can actually ingest them into our body. So basically, if we were to talk about the order of how things work in digestion, you always start with a polymer. And when I say a polymer, I mean our macronutrients. So our proteins, our lipids, our lipids, and our carbs. Our goal is to take the polymer and to break them down into their subunits or their monomers. Once they are into their monomers, so for example, protein, the monomer of protein was an amino acid. The monomer of lipids were glycerol and fatty acids. And the monomer of carbs is, glucose or fructose or galactose. They're all isomers of one another. So our goal is to get from polymer to monomer. And once we get to a monomer, then these subunits can be absorbed into our bloodstream. Absorbed into bloodstream or our lymph system. We'll talk about that later. But once it gets into our bloodstream or our lymph system, then these monomers can be absorbed into our cells. And from our cells, the nutrients will go into our mitochondria. And I know the only thing you know from Science 10 is that it's the powerhouse of the cell, but the mitochondria will take those monomers and convert it into energy in the form of ATP. And we've talked about ATP before in this class. But where we're focusing on with this lesson is going from polymer to monomer. How is it done? Well, it's done using enzymes. And that's why I had you guys watch the video on enzymes last week to get a sense of how they worked. Active site, activation energy, what proteins are made of, etc., etc. But today we're going to talk about how the enzymes actually break it down and specific to organs. And so let's start off with the first organ, the mouth. Unlike plants, humans, we have to consume large molecules. We got to break them down, and we have to break them down so they can be transported by the blood and absorbed and used by the body. So there's basically 4 steps to digestion. Number 1 is ingestion. I'm going to write that. 1, ingestion, which is a fancy word for eating or taking in nutrients. Second step is digestion. And there's essentially 2 types. There's mechanical, so the physical breakdown of food into smaller pieces. And the purpose of this is to increase the surface area. If we can increase the surface area of food, then it's going to help enzymes actually get to the site of the food and to break it down. The second type is called chemical. That's a weird way to write chemical. Chemical. And so that's the breaking of the bonds of enzymes. So chemical digestion, we usually think of things like acid. That's when the enzymes come in. So that's digestion, breaking things down. You can do it physically or you can do it chemically. And the third step in digestion is absorption, getting these monomers actually into our bloodstream. And the last step is egestion, which is a fancy scientific word for pooping. Those are basically the 4 steps. The mouth, obviously, is for ingestion. So, this is the mouth. You've seen it before because it was from the respiratory unit. The process of taking in nutrients and preparing them for transfer to the stomach is ingestion, and that's what the mouth does. So it undergoes digestion 2 ways, physically and chemically. The physical digestion is when the teeth actually just break down the food, and there's a fancy word for teeth chomping on things, and that is called Mastication. I know it sounds funny. Mastication is literally just taking food, chewing them into small particles. Your tongue positions food for chewing and later rolls the food into what's called a bolus. And a bolus gets passed along down your esophagus, and it moves in a wave-like muscle contraction. You have smooth muscle that line your esophagus, and those wave-like contractions are called peristalsis. So that the food, once it's all been chewed and into a ball, the ball is called a bolus, and it moves through peristalsis. Peristalsis. So what do the glands do? The glands help with chemical digestion. So salivary glands secrete saliva, so that's these guys. And the saliva does two things. It will moisten and lubricate the food, and it contains a special enzyme. And the enzyme that it contains is called amylase. And amylase will digest polysaccharides. So polysaccharides, for example, like starch. Sometimes we refer to starch or a form of starch as amylose. Amylose. And basically its job is to take starch or amylose and break it down into smaller sugars like disaccharides. So imagine a big long chain of amylose or starch, whatever it is. And I don't know why my drawing is so, but this goes on forever. Amylase, all enzymes are named usually with an ASE. Like I said all. Most enzymes, if it ends with ASE, it is an enzyme. And amylase will come in and it will act on the chemical bonds. And it will break it up. And what also usually happens is we have H2O as well, so it'll catalyze the reaction of water breaking those bonds. So it lowers the activation energy and helps that occur. And so eventually you just start ending up with disaccharides. So you might end up with something that's just like 2 subunits. So you might end up with something like similar to sucrose or lactose or maltose, something. I don't even know why I drew 3. It's got to be 2. Basically breaks it down. And what's interesting is you sense it all the time. Like next time when you're eating bread and you put it in your mouth and just let it sit there. Like sometimes with crackers, you let it sit in your mouth too long. Eventually the starch gets broken down by amylase and it starts to taste sweet to your tongue. And what is happening is that now you are sensing a kind of a simpler sugar similar to sucrose, and your taste buds interpret that as being kind of sweet, like a simple sugar, like glucose or like table sugar. So yeah, next time you're bored, which we all are, take a ball of bread, put it in your mouth, and see if it tastes sweet. Yeah. To recap, mastication is the physical breaking down of food. It increases the surface area of the food to allow enzymes or other chemicals to act on it. During the mouth, you have amylase, and it will break down just starches into disaccharides. Cheers.